Hello and welcome back to our central video series. So we're going to continue on with our AOS-Switch stack here that we've onboarded, and we're ready now to configure it. We want to show off some of the new UI configuration that we have with the latest enhancements in Central. Joining me today is Kamal Takodra from our Technical Marketing Engineering team. Kamal, how's it going? Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Justin. There's been a lot of additions to our UI configuration. What are some of the latest enhancements in Central for AOS-Switch?
Well, Kamal, there's been quite a bit that's been improved with UI groups and AOS-Switch. So we have new SNMP configuration, tunneling, so either port-based tunneling or user-based tunneling. We can now configure authentication priority. We can configure radius and set the radius server as a ClearPath server for downloadable roles. We can now configure downloadable roles. Routing has its own separate section now. It's no longer part of the IP settings. And we can also configure DHCP pools. So let's take a look at all this and see how it works. So here we have our group with our switch already loaded. From the group, we can go to Configure. And one of the first new enhancements, is that we've expanded our SNMP configuration. So by default, we have V2 configured with a public community. We're going to change this to V3. But before we do that, if we wanted to add a new community, we could do that from here. So we could add in a brand new community if we want to. We could set our traps, our destination, which community our network management station is going to be accessing the switch by. And then we can also set our trap category settings and the different various features that we can enable traps for the network management station. So in this case, let's focus on V3. So we're going to go ahead and remove our V2 configuration. So we'll click that, and then we need to add at least one V3 user to this. So we'll click the plus here. We'll add in our SNMP V3 user. We can change our authentication mode from MD5 or SHA. But we'll use the default here. And then we'll enter and confirm our passwords. And then our privacy mode, we have DES or AES encryption. We'll just use the default DES encryption, and then we'll click OK. So now our user's been created. So let's go ahead and configure our management station here. I'm going to use my save address, and then I'll select the SNMP V3 user that we're going to use. And then I'll just leave all the traps that are already selected. And then I'll click Save, and that's going to push the configuration to the switch in the background. Let's move over to the Security tab. One of the enhancements here that we have is for our user-based or port-based tunneling. So here we can select the mode of tunneling that we want to do. So let's say we want to do user-based tunneling. We'll put in our gateway IP that we want the switch to be able to access. If we have a backup cluster that we want to use, we could put the IP of that cluster, and then the reserved VLAN that we want to configure on the switch. And we'll go ahead and save that. So that's another new enhancement that we have, is that we can configure our user-based or port-based tunneling. We can also configure downloadable user roles. So we can select downloadable user roles here on the security. We can turn it on. Got to first configure ClearPass before we do that. So we can go to our radius and configure our radius server. So click on add our radius server, click on the plus here. And go ahead and enter our server IP. And then we want to select that as a ClearPass server and dynamic authorization if we're going to do any COAs. And then we'll save that. Okay, so now that we have our tunneling configured, let's take a look at some of the other enhancements that we have. So we have our radius server configured, and it's set for ClearPass. So then we can configure downloadable user roles, and we have that set with our login information for the switch to log in via a read-only administrator user to access ClearPass and be able to download the roles. So we just turn on this toggle switch and then we enter that information in. So then we can configure port authentication. One of the new enhancements is authentication order and priority. So in order to do that, we need to configure both 802.1x and MAC authentication on the port. So this feature is configurable only at the group level for standalone switches. Because we have a stack switch in the group, that we have to go select the stat conductor switch to configure this feature. So let's go into our devices. We'll go back to our switches. We actually want to go back to the list here. Then we'll go ahead and select our switch. And from here we can go to Device, Security, and then Authentication. So from here we can turn on .1x, select our authentication method. We're going to use EAP, and then we can select our ports that we want to configure authentication for. We can edit those, enable .1x. And so these are all the different timers and settings that we can do specific at the port level. So we want to set a client limit, so that's how many .1x clients we can have on the port. In AOS-Switch, it's up to 32 per port, so we'll just say 5. If we want to configure an unauthorized VLAN or an authorized VLAN, so by default, if the client isn't authorized or authenticated, it would get placed into an unauthorized VLAN. If it is authorized by default, it can be placed into an authorized VLAN ID, but we're not going to use those for the purposes of this. We want to change the reauth period. That controls the timer for how often a client will be reauthenticated for the Radius server. Cached reauth period is the time interval that if a client fails authentication, or if the Radius server not if the client fails authentications, if the Radius server connection drops, the client will stay authenticated until that time period expires. The cached reauthentication period expires. So if you set it for 300 seconds, that client will stay in session for 5 minutes. Then it will try a reauth to see if the Radius server is back up. Log off period, quiet period, transmit period, server timeout, supplicant timeout. These are all session timers that keep the session state in order. Quiet period has to do with how long the client waits to attempt to try to reconnect or reestablish authentication. The transmit period can adjust how often the port will transmit authentication packets to the Radius server. So once we're good with that, we can select OK. And then we can save those settings. Now we're going to configure MAC authentication. So we'll go ahead and select the same ports that we just configured .1x on. We can edit those ports. We're going to enable MAC authentication. And then same thing, we have all our timers. We'll just leave those defaults, and we'll go ahead and click OK. So now the key is the authentication order and priority. So here we can add. So for the ports that we've selected, we'll do 2, 3, and 4, the same ones we just selected. And then we can select the first order that we want the authentication to establish first. So say we want MAC authentication to try first, and then the priority will be given to either .1x or MAC. So say we want to give higher priority to .1x clients, but we'll first establish MAC authentication. If that fails, then .1x will be given priority, and then we can save that. So that was a commonly used feature in AOS-Switch. So we've covered port-based and user-based tunneling. We've covered authentication priority, configured the Radius server, and allowed ClearPass, we've established a setting that allows the Radius server to be declared as a ClearPass server, so then we can use downloadable roles, which we showed. So other new enhancements that we have is the routing tab, where we can click on routing, and all the IP settings, all the settings have been moved from IP settings into routing. So we can turn on, routing. Well, let's first add a default route. we'll just say 000, 000, and we'll just give a gateway and then save it. So if we wanted to turn on routing, we could turn on the toggle here, and then we can do static routing between VLANs if we wanted to. So we want to add in more routes. We can add more static routes for AOS-Switch. Finally, we've added in DHCP pools. So now if we click on DHCP, and if we add in a DHCP pool, we can give it a name, assign a network. We'll just say 100.0, a net mask. Oh, we got to do it in 255.255.0, the /24. Lease time, let's say 2 hours. We can say the default router is 254 here. And if we want to do, we can add in a DNS server. And then we can declare a range. Let's say 100 to 110. We can add that. And if we want to add in codes, we could do that as well. So we have to have a day there too. So make sure we have day there, hours, and minutes. And then when we're finished, click OK. And so now we have a DHCP pool configured. We can save that. And then we can turn on DHCP server and then save that setting as well. So once we're done making all these configuration changes, we can go to the configuration audit. And then we can see that the configuration is currently not in sync, so it's still deploying some configuration. So we can open that up, and then it should bring up our configuration sync issues. So it looks like we still need to update SNMP v3 and then our DHCP server pools. So we can see all our other configuration has been applied. We can see all our port access, auth order and priority has been configured. Tunneling has been enabled. And we have our tunneling command here. So if it's not in sync, we can try to force it, resync it, configuration push. So then after a period of time, the configuration gets into sync, and then we can validate that from if we view details. We can go to device running configuration, and then we can see that all of our configuration that we've configured in the UI is now in sync.
Amazing. There's a lot we can configure with AOS-Switch. We pretty much have all the basics covered. It seems much easier to just change config in the UI rather than have to edit a template and push the config to the switch for each change.
Absolutely. There's been a lot of work done to help simplify the process, and it's just so much easier configuring through a GUI.
Thanks, Justin, for showing me how to configure AOS-Switch UI groups.
You're welcome, Kamal. Thanks for joining me today. I hope this video was beneficial to everyone and that you were able to learn something from it. Thank you.